Good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling in from Brussels. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling in from Brussels, and I'm sorry I was not able to be with you today, but I really look forward to traveling to Portugal again very quickly. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the European Green Deal, and more in particular, the Fit for 55, or the legislative package, which the European Commission has proposed earlier this summer in order for Europe to commit to the Green Deal going forward, a package which also has an impact on European aviation, including on airlines. First of all, my name is Thomas Reynaert. I'm the Managing Director of Airlines for Europe. Airlines for Europe is the organization that represents the interest of all European commercial airlines since 2016. Our membership represents roughly 75% of Europe's passengers. And of course, we are going through very difficult times, which has been made clear over the past days at this conference for all of us, in particular for the airlines. And in addition to facing the COVID-19 crisis, we are facing the challenge of further greening European aviation. Before I go into talking about the European legislative package, or at least highlight some of the points that are really relevant to airlines, I would like maybe to take you to the next slide, which is really talking about Destination 2050. Destination 2050, as you can imagine, refers to the objective, the challenge of Europe to get to net zero by 2050. And the question, of course, for all of us, how do we do this in our particular sector? How do we do this as a citizen? How can we contribute to achieving this great goal that Europe has set itself in order to commit to the Paris Agreement, of course? And this is all about how to reduce CO2 emissions in the first instance. Now, European aviation and A4E has taken the lead on this some 2 years ago, has really started to look from a European aviation perspective how we could contribute to get to net zero by 2050. And in cooperation with esteemed institutes, European institutes, we have come to a roadmap, which is very practical, also clear, but also very committal from a European aviation perspective, how to get to net zero by 2050. So the European aviation sector, not only including airlines such as A4E, but also European regional airlines, but also airports, manufacturers, European manufacturers, and air navigation service providers have all joined forces in order to devise this roadmap. The roadmap, Destination 2050, which was published in February of this year, is really an unprecedented joint effort from the entire European aviation sector, making Europe the first region in the world to do so. Based on the independent work of the research consortium I referred to, we identified a possible path towards decarbonization by 2050, combining reduction of greenhouse emissions and, at the same time, growth, sustained traffic of 1.4% per year. So this is an important point. Not only will we reduce emissions, but at the same time, we will be able to continue to grow the sector. Our approach, as you can see from this slide, is based on 4 pillars. The most important one, having most of the impact, is first of all, aircraft and engine technology, which includes new aircraft, which will be flying on hydrogen, according to Airbus, as of 2035. The second biggest pillar in our roadmap are the sustainable aviation fuels. let me be very clear, we are talking about sustainable aviation fuels. Sustainable aviation fuels, which are actually based on sustainable feedstock, preferably coming from Europe. We all know that, by the way, the aviation sector is one of the most difficult sectors to decarbonize as we look at the European objectives. There is no panacea, but a range of measures such as these, we believe, are able to achieve our climate objective. The strategy also here foresees a predominance of economic measures such as EU ETS, of which, by the way, aviation has been part of since 2012, but also the global CORSIA, the global offsetting system. And this is the first step for us until 2030. And then, of course, the rise of technological solutions such as the aircraft technologies I just mentioned, but also sustainable aviation fuels between 2030 and 2050 will be very important. And among these measures, we find innovation, efficiency, and carbon pricing. You can also see on this slide the impact of improvements of CO2 reduction. In aircraft and engine technologies could reduce emissions by 37%. Neutrality will also go through the use of sustainable aviation fuels to reduce emissions by 34%. But also the implementation of the economic measures I just mentioned, ETS and CORSIA, could reduce emissions by 8%. And so finally, the fourth pillar, last but not least, is better air traffic management. Remember that for decades we are trying to reach a single European sky, which will allow us to fly in a much more fuel efficient and environment friendly manner. And unfortunately, we do not have the single European sky, not yet as we speak. We very much welcome the recent commitments of IATA and ATAC, which were made earlier this month, to follow a similar roadmap approach to achieve net zero by 2050. So this also proves that European aviation was on the right track to take an early commitment, to be proactive. And now, of course, when we go to the next slide, I will explain you a little bit high level what the European legislative package is all about. A package that should really lead us also to net zero by 2050. Now, the good news is, from an A4E perspective, that the Fit for 55 package, as it is called, the legislative package, in terms of the impact on aviation, the roadmap that the European Commission is proposing, the regulations that they are proposing, are very much in line with the same rationale that the A4E Destination 2050 roadmap is proposing. I just put here on the slide a couple of references to legislative dossiers. First of all, CORSIA ETS, let me start with that, is really there to ensure cost effectiveness. In order for us to ensure cost effectiveness, economic measures must be market-based. And EU ETS is a system that does this. CORSIA, which is the UN CO2 mitigation scheme, if it needs to show higher emissions, needs to implement it in full and with no discrimination between EU and non-EU carriers. That is going to be a very important point going forward as we talk with the European Commission. In the meantime, of course, the reform of EU ETS needs to take into account consideration of the fact that the sector is going through its worst crisis in decades. This is really the reality check again. In terms of ETD, so the European Taxation Directive, or the review of that directive, we are very clear. According to also our Destination 2050 analysis, clearly we have shown that aligning an industry with EU climate targets can be done without further taxation of our sector. Our sector is already subject to many costs inexistent in other modes of transport. We have costs that are directly related to the use of airports, air traffic, and security. So we don't need another European tax, which, by the way, would not be very effective to reduce CO2 emissions. In terms of the Refuel Initiative, what the Refuel EU Aviation Initiative is referring to is, again, what I mentioned earlier in terms of the roadmap, is the sustainable aviation fuels. There is really the need to scale up and commercialize sustainable aviation fuels. This is one of the main challenges that Europe has, and not only Europe, by the way, it's a global challenge. We have not enough sustainable aviation fuels available today. SAFs cost also roughly 2 to 7 times more than the fossil fuels, the kerosene that we're using today. The main economic barriers are related to the higher cost compared to the fossil fuel kerosene and the investment risk associated with a new market. Different types of incentives to bridge the price gap with fossil fuels will really need to be considered. And the proposal of the European Commission, Refuel EU Aviation, is going into the right direction, asking for certain very clear quotas as we go along towards 2050, quotas from the fuel suppliers. And of course, in terms of allowances, carbon leakage and carbon border adjustment mechanism, let me say something about this, just one line. So the decarbonization of aviation should not happen at the expense of the welfare and not leave any regions or part of the population worst off. At the end of the day, let us remind us that these green measures, of course, in itself are not new as they were in the pipeline. We were expecting them. But of course, the timing when they come to the market, when we'll have to deal with them and invest in green technology, really come at a very difficult time because we're all trying to get out of the COVID crisis. And this is really where I would like to stop. I would like to thank you for attention. I wanted to keep it high level as part of the keynote, but would be happy to take questions if there would be an opportunity following that. Even if not during this conference, I'm happy to take calls or emails offline. Thank you very much and have a good day.